The wind arrived before the rain, rattling every shutter across Ashcombe Estate as though the ancient manor itself sensed tragedy approaching. Servants hurried through dim corridors carrying steaming water, fresh linen, and whispered prayers while thunder rolled over the hills. Inside the grand bedchamber, Duke Alistair Ashcombe stood powerless beside the woman he loved. Duchess Eleanor's face had grown pale from endless hours of labor, yet her tired eyes searched only for her husband. When the fragile cries of their newborn finally filled the room, relief lasted only a heartbeat before the physician's expression darkened. Eleanor smiled weakly, reached for Alistair's trembling hand, and whispered, "Trust the one with the kindest hands, not the finest name." Before he could ask what she meant, her fingers slipped from his grasp forever. Grief settled over Ashcombe more heavily than the storm clouds outside. Black drapes covered mirrors, candles burned through sleepless nights, and every servant walked softly as though loud footsteps might disturb the Duchess's memory. Alistair scarcely left the nursery, refusing meals and ignoring correspondence from Parliament. His entire world narrowed to the tiny cradle beside the fireplace, where his son, Theodore, fought for every breath with astonishing determination. The infant possessed bright blue eyes identical to Eleanor's, yet no warmth reached them because hunger kept replacing comfort. The Duke believed saving his son was the final promise he could keep to his wife. England's finest wet nurses soon arrived in elegant carriages from every direction. Physicians praised their experience, noble families recommended their names, and each woman confidently declared she could soothe any child. Theodore rejected every one of them. Some he refused to touch. Others he pushed away with surprising strength for a newborn. He screamed until his tiny face reddened and his exhausted body shook. Doctors changed feeding methods, warmed milk differently, adjusted blankets, and examined him repeatedly, yet nothing eased his desperate cries. Each failed attempt deepened the fear spreading through the estate. Servants whispered behind kitchen doors that perhaps grief had cursed the Ashcombe air. Even seasoned nurses quietly admitted they had never witnessed anything like it. Among those invisible to the nobility was Clara Whitmore, a 24-year-old laundry maid whose days began before sunrise and ended long after darkness covered the estate. She rarely spoke unless spoken to, yet everyone noticed her kindness. She stitched torn sleeves without accepting payment, shared fresh bread with stable boys who skipped meals, and secretly delivered soup to Samuel Briggs, the elderly blind gardener living in a small cottage beyond the rose gardens. Whenever frightened servant children cried, Clara somehow found gentle words that made them smile again. Few realized she carried sorrow as quietly as she carried laundry baskets. Months earlier, illness had stolen her own newborn son before he had even learned to open his eyes fully. Since then, she visited the tiny grave whenever her duties allowed, placing wildflowers there instead of tears. Lady Beatrice Ravenshaw observed everything from behind polished manners and carefully measured smiles. As Alistair's widowed aunt, she offered condolences, supervised expensive funeral arrangements, and publicly insisted every possible resource be devoted to Theodore's survival. Privately, however, disappointment sharpened her thoughts. Without the infant, the Ashcombe fortune would eventually drift toward her own ambitious nephew, Edmund. She never voiced such hopes aloud. Instead, she planted subtle doubts among guests, wondering whether desperate servants or incompetent physicians endangered the child more than fate itself. Every carefully chosen remark nudged suspicion away from herself while feeding uncertainty throughout the household. By the seventh night, Theodore's cries had become unbearable. They echoed through corridors, drifted across gardens, and stole sleep from everyone beneath the estate's roof. Clara paused outside the nursery carrying folded linens. She listened carefully, her heart tightening with every broken sob. It was not merely hunger she heard. It was loneliness. The sound awakened memories she struggled every day to bury. She knew the ache of reaching for comfort that never came. Ignoring the anxious protests of a young footman, Clara quietly stepped inside. The physician looked exhausted, the Duke looked defeated, and another celebrated wet nurse stood weeping after another failure. Alistair barely noticed the maid until she set the linens aside and approached the cradle with calm, unhurried movements. "Your Grace," she said softly, meeting his grief rather than his title, he isn't searching for milk. He's searching for someone who makes the world feel safe. Silence settled across the nursery. Alistair should have ordered her removed, yet Eleanor's final words echoed relentlessly inside his mind. Clara lifted Theodore with practiced gentleness, humming a simple lullaby barely louder than breathing. Almost instantly, the frantic crying faded into quiet hiccups. The baby's tiny fingers curled around hers, his body relaxed, and his searching eyes finally closed. Astonished, the physician nodded permission. Moments later, Theodore accepted nourishment peacefully for the very first time. Tears blurred Alistair's vision as hope returned with every swallow, while unnoticed in the shadowed doorway, Lady Beatrice slowly tightened her gloved hands, realizing the poorest woman in Ashcombe had become the greatest threat to everything she had planned. Morning sunlight finally pierced the storm clouds, spilling across Ashcombe Estate with a warmth no one had expected to witness so soon after such unbearable grief. Word spread through every hallway that the Duke's son had slept peacefully through the night for the first time since his birth. Servants who had spent days whispering fearful prayers exchanged cautious smiles, while the physicians admitted they could not explain the remarkable change. Theodore refused every attempt to remove him from Clara's arms, settling only when he heard her heartbeat or the gentle lullaby that had quieted him before dawn. Even the seasoned nursemaids who had arrived from London's finest households watched in bewildered silence, unable to deny what their own eyes revealed. Alistair remained beside the cradle throughout the morning, studying Clara with quiet intensity. She never behaved as though she had accomplished something extraordinary. Instead, she changed linens, soothed Theodore whenever he stirred, and thanked every servant who entered the nursery. She asked permission before touching anything belonging to the Duke's family, never forgetting that she was merely a laundry maid standing where noble women had failed. That humility unsettled Alistair more than confidence would have. Every instinct warned him to remain cautious, yet Theodore's peaceful breathing slowly dismantled the walls grief had built around his heart. Dr. Nathaniel Harrow examined the infant again before breakfast. Theodore's pulse had strengthened, his color had improved, and his desperate crying had vanished. Whatever comfort Miss Whitmore provides, the physician admitted quietly, it reaches the child more deeply than medicine ever could. Alistair nodded without speaking, unwilling to place hope into words that might disappear as quickly as they had arrived. He had buried one dream already. He refused to tempt fate by celebrating another too soon. Across the estate, Lady Beatrice concealed her growing frustration beneath flawless composure. During breakfast she praised Clara's dedication before assembled guests, calling her a fortunate blessing sent in desperate times. Her gracious smile convinced nearly everyone except Edmund, who recognized the dangerous stillness behind his aunt's eyes. Later, inside her private sitting room, the smile vanished completely. "One servant cannot be allowed to rewrite our future," she murmured. Edmund leaned against the fireplace, confidence replacing concern. "Then we make certain no one trusts her long enough for that to happen." Lady Beatrice simply nodded, already shaping a plan built upon whispers rather than open accusations. Clara accepted none of the attention surrounding her unexpected role. Between caring for Theodore, she continued helping in the laundry whenever possible, refusing special treatment despite repeated offers. She quietly repaired torn uniforms, polished silver forgotten by exhausted footmen, and carried fresh bread to Samuel Briggs before sunrise. The elderly gardener smiled as she placed the basket beside him. "You sound lighter today," he observed. Clara looked toward the distant manor where Theodore rested. "One child found peace," she answered softly. "Perhaps that's enough to help another heart keep beating." That afternoon, Theodore laughed for the very first time. The tiny sound lasted only seconds after Clara gently brushed his nose with her fingertip, yet it transformed the nursery. The servants froze before smiling through tears. Alistair looked up from the chair beside the window, astonished by a joy he feared his son might never know. The laughter echoed against walls that had witnessed only mourning since Eleanor's death. For one fragile moment, grief loosened its grip upon everyone inside the room. As the days passed, Alistair noticed details about Clara that no report or introduction could have revealed. She never complained despite sleeping only a few hours each night. She remembered every servant's name regardless of rank. She always ate after everyone else, ensuring no child or laborer remained hungry first. Whenever Theodore slept, she embroidered tiny repairs into his blankets so carefully that no stitch could be seen. Watching her became impossible to avoid. She carried sadness with quiet dignity, never seeking sympathy, yet kindness seemed to flow naturally from every choice she made. One rainy evening Alistair entered the nursery carrying fresh firewood after dismissing the footmen early. He found Clara asleep in the rocking chair, Theodore resting peacefully against her shoulder. Her hand still cradled the baby's tiny back even in sleep, protecting him through instinct alone. A loose curl had escaped beneath her bonnet, and exhaustion softened the sorrow usually hidden behind her composed expression. Without waking either of them, Alistair draped his coat gently across her shoulders before kneeling beside the cradle. For the first time since Eleanor's passing, silence inside the nursery felt comforting instead of empty. The fragile peace shattered the following morning when Dr. Harrow examined several discarded feeding bottles left behind by the dismissed wet nurses. Frowning, he scraped a faint residue from one glass rim and lifted it toward the window. The scent reminded him of sleeping herbs commonly used in measured doses for restless adults. Such herbs should never have been anywhere near a newborn. He immediately ordered every remaining bottle collected before quietly informing the Duke that someone inside Ashcombe had done far more than fail Theodore. Someone had deliberately ensured the infant remained too weak to survive, and hidden beyond the nursery door, Clara overheard every devastating word with growing dread. The physician's warning settled over Ashcombe Estate like another gathering storm. Although no announcement was made beyond the Duke's private study, unease spread through the household with astonishing speed. Servants noticed doors being locked earlier than usual, unfamiliar guards patrolling the corridors, and whisper conversations ending the moment anyone approached. Alistair ordered every bottle, cloth, spoon, and medicine jar from the nursery collected and examined. Nothing would enter Theodore's room without Dr. Harrow's approval. The Duke had already lost his wife. He refused to lose his son because someone hidden behind polished manners considered an innocent child an obstacle. Clara left the study carrying Theodore against her shoulder, her thoughts tangled with fear. She had known cruelty before, yet the idea that someone could deliberately harm a helpless newborn unsettled her more deeply than any hardship she had endured. Theodore stirred as though sensing her distress, and she gently stroked his tiny back until he settled again. Looking into his peaceful face, she silently promised that no matter who threatened him, she would never abandon him. It was the same promise she had once whispered beside the grave of the child she could not save. Lady Beatrice welcomed the new security measures with practiced grace, praising the Duke's caution before guests while secretly adjusting her plans. She understood that poison and hidden herbs would now attract dangerous attention. Fear, however, could still become a weapon. Quietly, she instructed servants loyal to her family to spread rumors that Clara possessed unnatural influence over Theodore. Some whispered she practiced old village charms. Others insisted no ordinary maid could calm a child rejected by every respected nurse in England. By evening, frightened speculation drifted through kitchens and stables like smoke, reaching ears eager to believe anything mysterious rather than accept simple kindness. Mrs. Agnes Pembroke, the stern housekeeper, heard enough to intervene. Gathering the servants after supper, she fixed them with a gaze capable of silencing entire rooms. If compassion appears miraculous, she declared firmly, perhaps the miracle is how little of it some people have shown. No one answered. Several servants lowered their eyes in embarrassment. Clara, standing quietly near the doorway, felt gratitude she struggled to express. Mrs. Pembroke had rarely spoken more than practical instructions to her, yet those few sentences carried the weight of genuine protection. That night the rain returned, drumming steadily against tall nursery windows while Theodore slept peacefully beside the fire. Alistair remained nearby reviewing estate records, though his attention wandered repeatedly toward Clara as she carefully folded tiny garments. Neither interrupted the comforting silence until Theodore whimpered softly during his sleep. Clara crossed the room immediately, resting one reassuring hand upon his blanket. The infant relaxed without waking. Alistair watched the effortless gesture before speaking quietly. How do you always know what he needs? Clara smiled sadly without looking away from the cradle. Sometimes people cry because they're hungry. Sometimes they cry because they're frightened. The hardest part is learning which pain they're trying to hide. Her words lingered long after the conversation ended. They described far more than a restless infant. Alistair realized they reflected his own heart with unsettling accuracy. Since Eleanor's death, everyone had offered advice, sympathy, or duty, yet almost no one had recognized the fear buried beneath his grief. Clara never questioned his silence or urged him toward recovery. She simply created moments where sorrow no longer ruled every breath. That quiet understanding felt rarer than comfort itself. The following afternoon, Jonathan Mercer arrived unexpectedly at Ashcombe Estate. Age had bent his shoulders but not his sharp eyes, and travel dust still covered his coat when he requested a private audience with the Duke. Introducing himself as a solicitor recently returned from the continent, he claimed to possess legal documents concerning old estates and unresolved inheritances. Alistair, distracted by Theodore's recovery and the physician's investigation, agreed to meet him the following morning. As Mercer left the study, he crossed paths with Clara in the corridor. The folded linens slipped from her arms as recognition flashed across his weathered face. "My lady," he whispered before catching himself. Clara's expression changed instantly. Shock replaced calm, followed by unmistakable fear. She hurriedly gathered the fallen linens and shook her head almost imperceptibly. Mercer understood at once. Whatever identity she had buried, she desperately wished it to remain forgotten. He bowed respectfully without another word and continued walking, though his troubled glance revealed that years of silence had ended the moment he recognized her. From the balcony overlooking the entrance hall, Lady Beatrice witnessed the brief exchange. She could not hear the words, yet she saw Clara's pale face and the old solicitor's astonishment. Curiosity sharpened into suspicion. She summoned Edmund before sunset, describing everything she had observed. "Find out who that man is," she ordered. "People do not look at ordinary servants as though they have seen ghosts." Edmund smiled confidently. "If the maid carries secrets, we shall uncover them before she becomes impossible to remove." Meanwhile, Dr. Harrow completed his examination of the feeding bottles. The residue confirmed his growing fears. Small amounts of powerful sleeping herbs had been mixed repeatedly into Theodore's milk. Individually the doses appeared harmless. Together they weakened the infant until hunger became exhaustion and exhaustion became danger. Someone knowledgeable had planned carefully, expecting every failure to resemble ordinary illness. When the physician shared his findings privately, Alistair's grief hardened into controlled anger. Betrayal had entered his own home disguised as service. Extra guards surrounded the nursery that evening, yet Clara noticed something else. One maid assigned temporarily to Theodore's care seemed unusually nervous whenever Dr. Harrow entered the room. The woman avoided eye contact, dropped a silver spoon with trembling hands, and left at the earliest opportunity despite claiming illness. Clara mentioned the behavior quietly to Mrs. Pembroke, who promised to watch more closely. Neither woman realized the frightened maid had already carried news of the investigation straight to Lady Beatrice. Near midnight, Clara carried Theodore through the moonlit gallery overlooking the gardens, hoping the gentle movement would lull him back to sleep after an unexpected awakening. The manor remained unusually quiet, broken only by distant thunder beyond the hills. As she reached the end of the corridor, she glimpsed a shadow slipping through the nursery door they had just left behind. Her heartbeat quickened. Clutching Theodore protectively, she hurried back without making a sound. The room appeared empty until she noticed the curtains moving despite the closed windows. Someone had escaped moments earlier, leaving one tiny glass bottle rolling slowly across the polished floor. Clara picked it up with trembling fingers. Even before smelling the bitter herbs inside, she understood the terrifying truth. Whoever had tried to harm Theodore was still inside Ashcombe, watching every move, waiting patiently for another chance. The discovery of the hidden bottle changed the atmosphere of Ashcombe Estate in ways no one could ignore. Doors were no longer left unguarded, conversations were cut short mid-sentence, and every servant moved with careful restraint as though the walls themselves might be listening. Dr. Harrow sealed the nursery personally and insisted that only he, the Duke, and Clara handle anything related to Theodore's care. Alistair agreed without hesitation. Trust, once broken, was not easily restored, especially when it concerned the life of his only child. Clara could not sleep that night. Theodore rested safely beside her, yet her thoughts refused peace. She replayed every face she had seen near the nursery, every trembling hand, every avoided glance. The realization that danger still lived within the estate unsettled her more than any storm. She sat beside the cradle, silently counting the child's breaths as though doing so could keep him anchored in the world. At times she brushed her fingers gently across his forehead, reassuring herself that warmth still remained beneath his skin. At dawn, Jonathan Mercer requested immediate audience with the Duke. This time he carried a locked wooden case bound with iron edges. Inside were documents older than Theodore himself, carefully preserved through years of concealment. Alistair, now hardened by suspicion, summoned Dr. Harrow and Oliver Finch before allowing Mercer to speak. Clara was present at Mercer's insistence, though she remained slightly behind the others, holding Theodore close. Mercer placed the case on the desk and opened it with deliberate precision. Inside lay property deeds, correspondence, and legal seals bearing the Ashford crest, long believed destroyed in a fire. He explained that he had spent years tracing fraudulent transfers across multiple estates. Each document pointed back to one network of influence, quietly redirecting wealth from rightful heirs into the hands of a single powerful household. As Mercer spoke, Clara's grip tightened around Theodore. The name Ashford echoed through her mind like a buried memory forcing itself into light. Alistair studied the papers in silence. His controlled expression slowly gave way to disbelief as he read names he recognized from old social records. One signature, however, drew his attention more sharply than the rest. It belonged to Lady Beatrice Ravenshaw, witnessed repeatedly across falsified transfers. Finch confirmed the signature matched historical estate filings from decades earlier. Dr. Harrow, though not a legal expert, muttered that such coordination could only exist with long-term planning. Clara stepped forward despite herself. "That crest," she whispered. "I have seen it before." Mercer turned toward her carefully, as though fearing the weight of what he was about to reveal. "Because you once lived beneath it," he said softly. The room fell silent. Alistair looked between them, confusion sharpening into concern. Mercer hesitated only a moment before continuing. "Lady Clara Ashford, daughter of the late Earl of Ashford. Your family's estate was taken through forged authority after your father's death." The words struck Clara with controlled violence. For a moment she could not breathe. Memories she had buried returned in fragments, a burning hall, whispered arguments, a carriage fleeing into darkness. Theodore shifted in her arms, grounding her before the past could fully consume her. Alistair watched her carefully now, realizing the maid he had trusted was not who she claimed to be. Yet instead of anger, what surfaced first was understanding. He had lost Eleanor. Clara had lost everything else. Mercer revealed the final piece. The same network responsible for the Ashford fraud had expanded its reach over the years, manipulating estates through marriage, debt, and silent coercion. At its center stood Lady Beatrice Ravenshaw, using family influence to disguise systemic theft. Alistair felt something cold settle within him. The attempts on Theodore's life were no longer isolated incidents. They were part of something far more deliberate. Before the meeting could conclude, a crash echoed from the corridor outside the study. Edmund Ravenshaw entered without announcement, eyes fixed on Mercer's case. "Old documents mean nothing without witnesses," he said sharply. Finch immediately stepped between him and the desk, but Edmund's gaze shifted toward Clara instead. Recognition flickered, though not of identity, but of threat. "So this is the maid who now controls the air," he added coldly. Clara instinctively stepped back, shielding Theodore. Alistair rose slowly, voice dangerously calm. "Leave." Edmund smiled faintly, refusing to move. "Be careful, Your Grace. Not every forgotten noble returns seeking justice. Some return seeking revenge." His words lingered deliberately before he finally exited, leaving behind a silence heavier than before. That evening, Clara made a decision she could no longer avoid. If her identity placed Theodore in danger, remaining hidden was no longer an option. She asked Mercer to confirm every surviving record he possessed. As he did, she noticed Dr. Harrow watching her with quiet concern rather than judgment. Mrs. Pembroke later found Clara alone in the nursery, staring at the sleeping child with unmistakable sorrow. "You are not the danger here," the housekeeper said firmly. Clara shook her head. "People who love him are being targeted because of me." Mrs. Pembroke did not argue. Instead, she placed a hand on Clara's shoulder, rare gentleness breaking her usual discipline. "Then perhaps it is time the truth stood where lies have ruled too long." Late that night, Clara wrote a letter she never intended to send, sealing it with trembling hands. Outside, thunder rolled again over Ashcombe Estate, but this time it carried no storm of weather. It carried the weight of truths long buried, rising at last toward the surface. In the distance, unseen by anyone inside the manor, a carriage halted beyond the gates. A veiled woman stepped down slowly, watching the lit windows of the nursery with patient certainty, as though she had been waiting years for this exact moment to arrive. The night Clara wrote her letter did not end with sleep. Instead, it ended with silence so heavy that even the rain seemed hesitant to fall. Theodore rested peacefully beside her, unaware that the world around him had begun to shift toward its final reckoning. In the distance, beyond the estate's iron gates, the unseen carriage remained motionless, its occupant waiting with patient calculation. Clara pressed the sealed letter against her chest once before placing it on the desk, as though releasing it might release her fate along with it. At dawn, the entire estate awakened to an unfamiliar stillness. Dr. Harrow arrived earlier than usual, followed closely by Oliver Finch and Mrs. Pembroke, each summoned without explanation. Alistair stood in the corridor outside the nursery, composed but visibly altered, as if the weight of every hidden truth had settled permanently within him. Clara joined them moments later carrying Theodore, whose quiet breathing remained the only source of warmth in the tense gathering. No one spoke at first. Even the servants lingered at a distance, sensing that whatever would happen next could not be contained within private walls. The first sound came from the entrance hall below. Heavy footsteps, measured and deliberate, echoed through the marble floors. Then the doors opened. Lady Beatrice Ravenshaw entered without haste, her veil lifted slowly as though revealing herself to judgment rather than greeting. Edmund followed behind her, expression tight with controlled defiance. Between them, Jonathan Mercer stood waiting, holding the final document unopened. The household froze as the woman who had once been considered untouchable crossed into the heart of the estate she had quietly shaped for years. "I expected gratitude, not accusations," Lady Beatrice said calmly, her voice carrying the refinement of decades spent in power. Alistair stepped forward, his tone colder than any servant had ever heard. "We expected truth." The simple response silenced her momentarily. Clara instinctively tightened her hold on Theodore, sensing that even the air had become dangerous. Mrs. Pembroke moved closer without hesitation, standing beside her as silent support. Dr. Harrow positioned himself between the accused and the child, ensuring no one could approach unnoticed. Mercer finally opened the sealed document. Every page confirmed what had already been suspected: forged transfers, manipulated inheritances, concealed deaths, and a long history of estates absorbed under false authority. As each line was read aloud, Lady Beatrice's composure began to fracture. Edmund attempted interruption, but Finch calmly produced a secondary ledger recovered from the archives, linking him directly to recent attempts on Theodore's life. The revelation struck harder than any accusation, leaving no room for denial. Clara stepped forward for the first time since the confrontation began. Her voice remained steady, though emotion trembled beneath it. "You took everything from my family," she said. "And when that was not enough, you tried to take a child who never belonged to your ambition." The words did not echo anger, but exhaustion shaped by years of silence. Lady Beatrice looked at her closely now, truly seeing her for the first time. Recognition flickered, followed by something almost like regret, though it was quickly buried beneath pride. Alistair turned toward Clara, his expression shifting from authority to something far more vulnerable. "Is this your choice?" he asked quietly. She hesitated, then nodded. "I cannot stay hidden while others suffer for it." Theodore stirred at the sound of her voice, reaching instinctively toward her chest. The movement did not go unnoticed. Even in the middle of confrontation, the child's loyalty remained absolute. What followed was not chaos, but resolution. Guards entered to escort Lady Beatrice and Edmund from the estate, not in violence, but in irreversible consequence. No protest changed the outcome. Years of manipulation collapsed under the weight of undeniable truth. As they were led away, Lady Beatrice paused only once, her gaze fixed not on Alistair, but on Theodore. "He will never understand what was sacrificed for this family," she said softly before disappearing beyond the doors. Silence returned, but it no longer felt oppressive. It felt final. Mercer closed the document and placed it on the desk, bowing slightly before departing without further words. Dr. Harrow confirmed that no further traces of poison or sedatives remained in the nursery. Mrs. Pembroke gave a rare sigh of relief, as though some long-standing burden had finally lifted from her shoulders. In the days that followed, the estate changed in ways both visible and subtle. Servants no longer whispered in fear but spoke openly in relief. Gardens once neglected were restored. Rooms once closed were reopened. Yet the greatest change occurred within Alistair himself. He no longer stood apart from those around him. Instead, he walked among them, sharing in small tasks, speaking without distance, listening without restraint. Clara prepared to leave once more, believing that her truth had been fulfilled but her place still uncertain. She packed quietly, avoiding unnecessary attention, until Theodore crawled into her path and refused to move. When Alistair found her at the doorway, he did not stop her immediately. Instead, he knelt beside Theodore and gently asked, "Where do you wish her to go?" The child responded by reaching for Clara and pressing his forehead against her hand, refusing separation with unwavering certainty. That moment changed everything. Alistair rose slowly, his voice no longer uncertain. "Then there is no decision left to make." He took Clara's trembling hand not as a duke, but as a man who had finally understood the value of what stood before him. No grand declaration followed. Only understanding. Weeks later, the estate opened its gates not for punishment or fear, but for celebration. The Ashcombe grounds transformed into a place of restored harmony, where servants and nobles shared space without distance. Clara did not abandon her past identity, nor did she lose the life she had built. Instead, she rebuilt it within truth, standing beside Alistair as equal rather than subject. Theodore grew surrounded by safety that no longer depended on secrecy or fear. On a quiet afternoon beneath the old oak tree, the same place where grief had once begun, Theodore ran laughing across the grass. Clara and Alistair watched from a shaded bench, their silence no longer burdened but peaceful. The Duke finally spoke without hesitation. "Everything began with loss," he said softly, "but it did not end there." Clara looked toward the horizon where sunlight touched the estate like a promise fulfilled. "No," she replied. "It ended with choice." As the wind moved gently through the gardens, Theodore called out for them both, his voice bright with certainty and life. And as they rose together to follow him, the estate that had once been defined by secrecy, grief, and manipulation now stood transformed into something entirely new, where truth had not destroyed what remained, but finally allowed it to live.